thanks to our attendees today. I really appreciate it. I know it's a sort of a weird time, but I'm still looking forward to this conversation between Anthony Orlando, who is a assistant professor at Cal Poly Pomona, and A. Price, PhD, a longtime friend of the Bedrosian Center. And if you missed Tuesday's event, our first event in this series we're calling Dividing Lines, on Anthony's new book, it will be up on YouTube, and I hope that you will watch it. And I hope that you'll read his book, and I hope that you will read Janice's new book, Color of Kindness. And you are an alum of USC Marshall, right, Janice?
Yes, an undergrad as well as an MBA of the Marshall School.
Fantastic. And you have a great story to tell. I'm going to make myself scarce. Thank you both for doing this. I'm excited to have this conversation. And if you have questions, everybody, put them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll hopefully have time at the end. Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Aubrey. So Janice, thank you for joining us. I could do a long introduction of Janice's biography, but I actually think that that's a lot of what we're going to talk about today. So I want to let her tell most of her life story herself. But before we do that, I want to just emphasize the book title is The Kindness of Color. So you can go on Amazon and find that, obviously anytime during this talk or afterwards, but it's The Kindness of Color. So Janice, before we dive into the story itself, maybe you could talk about the title of the book. You know, kindness is a running theme throughout the book. And I know that a lot of your work is based on kindness and focused on, I'm sure you do a lot of loving kindness meditation practice and so on. For a lot of our viewers who maybe aren't as steeped in current practices in mindfulness and spirituality, maybe you could talk a little bit about what kindness means to you and how it inspired you through this journey.
Sure. It was really mostly a discovery. As Sylvia Mendez and I would share the stories of her family and our family in the 1940s, what was striking to the audiences, just various groups of people, was they wanted to know more about the families. And so as we'd share those stories, we began to realize how many pivotal moments there were where somebody, a neighbor, a friend, even strangers, would offer a hand, offer some advice, offer a connection, offer help. And how that really, as I put it together, I actually noted it in my book. This is the book. But all of these gray tabs here are different moments of pivotal kindness. And so when I started writing the stories down, I thought, wow, it's really telling how people who were bankers, truck drivers, judges, teachers, neighbors, friends would do something. And to them, it might not have seemed like a big deal. But I think when you add it all up, it gave our families hope and assurance that they could persevere through the different trials, based on people just standing with them, and not necessarily even standing with them for a cause, but saying, you know, you need a place to leave your things while you're being incarcerated during World War II. We can take care of your things for you. So it was those moments where I think led up, when you capture all of those, you find how many people offered hands of kindness, offered kindness. And that really, when you add it all up, really made a difference. And certainly there was injustice. Certainly there were issues of what equality looks like, what segregation looks like, what desegregation looks like. But when Sylvia Mendez and I speak, we always go, and then somebody, and then someone showed up, and then somebody said something, and then someone came with help. And so I want it really to be inspiring that, as humans and people, that we can inspire others, even in the difficulties of life.
You know, as I was reading your book and those moments kept popping up, the and then as you talk about each person, some of them were big and some of them were small moments.
Mhm.
And, you know, it occurred to me that a lot of the people who were displaying kindness, they weren't making huge sacrifices, but what they were doing was they were being thoughtful. They were recognizing that they could be of help to someone, even in a small way. And what makes it extraordinary is the fact that most people too often just overlook those moments and don't recognize the opportunity that they have right in front of them to help someone. And it may not be a big sacrifice. It's just being present in the moment and not rushing through our lives and missing those opportunities. Did it feel that way to you as you were reflecting on a lot of these moments?
Yeah, totally. I think your comment about being present is so important, because in most of these, they listened, they understood the challenge or the issue at hand or the pain that was being um, experienced, and then they did what they could. So in some cases, it might have been even non-verbally, caring for someone just by being present and really seeing them and listening. In other cases, there was significant advice or connections that were made, um, ideas, problem solving. But I think if they had rushed through this, they would have seen the challenges way too big and said, well, there's nothing that one person can do, which is probably true. But collectively, people took the time and said, what do you need? Or how can we help? Even in the small way. And I think just because of time passing and the age of most of the people in this time frame, most of them have passed, and they don't really know, in some cases, what the part of their story led to or what happened next, right? But I think that's the beauty in just being present, listening, seeing where you might be able to help, or maybe someone who can, and then offering that. But I think it's a lot about people being seen, seen and heard, right? And then responding as you can. And it may just be, we're with you, we're praying for you. What can we do? We want to stay in contact. We're your friends. Even when everyone else seems against you, we're with you. But it is telling. I just recently did this. I went and made put little gray markers every time there was a kindness mentioned. And there were probably more, but these are the ones I noted. And it's notable. I mean, there's a lot. There's a lot of things that a lot of people did.
Yeah. I like that phrase, doing what they could. In a lot of the work that I do in public policy, we're very good at identifying problems. And it's a lot harder to try to fix them. And so I constantly get the question, well, but what should we do about it?
Mm-hmm.
And part of people's motivation for that question is that they feel powerless when they're confronted with big, difficult problems in society. And sometimes the best answer is just do what you can, even if it feels like it's too small to make a difference. I think one of the things that your book really illustrates is that no act is too small. It might seem small to you, but it might have very big ramifications on people's lives, especially in the long run, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So that's one of the lessons that I really took away from it.
Mm-hmm.
So let's go back into the history now. So let's start by setting the stage for the audience. What is the experience that these two families had as immigrant families in America? Slightly different backgrounds, but a lot of commonalities. Can you kind of paint a picture for the audience of what it was like around the turn of the century?
Sure. My grandfather came to America when he was about 16, 17 years old in 1916 from Japan. His father was already here working on a farm in the Torrance area. They called it Carson Ranch. And so they worked there. He subsequently went back to Japan, married my grandmother. They came back as newlyweds in 1921 and continued to work on the ranch. So they were working for other farmers. My father was born in 1922, so he would be 100 years old next year. And significantly, my grandfather, there's lots of reasons why we could see why my grandfather really wanted to be an American. He, I just realized this weekend, my aunts and I were talking, and my grandfather had a picture of George Washington on his living room wall. And it was only maybe about this big. And I always remember seeing it. But now, in retrospect, we thought there weren't a lot of families that had George Washington on their living room wall. He also really, he wanted his children to call him Pops. It was Mom and Pops, as opposed to the Japanese term, which a lot of our friends, the first generations, went by Oba-san and Oji-san. And so, but our grandparents were always Mom and Pop. So he had a definite desire to be an American, whatever that looked like for him at the time. And my father was born between the day after, actually, Lincoln's birthday and the day before Valentine's Day. And they actually gave him an English middle name. They gave him the middle name of Lincoln. So another reference to why they are now in America with a brand new marriage, brand new son, and his middle name is Lincoln. My dad always said it's a good thing they didn't choose Valentine, not knowing, the day of love and everything, and their first son, but they named him Lincoln. So I think my grandfather really wanted to embrace the new opportunity. He came to work. He came for more opportunity than he would have had in Japan, for sure, as did a lot of our Japanese immigrant first generation Issei friends. And he later got the opportunity to own land, but due to the alien land laws, he wasn't able to buy land, and he probably didn't have the resources to. He had to save up to do that. The Mendez family comes from Mexico initially, and Mrs. Mendez actually from Puerto Rico. But they came also for more opportunity. Very hardworking couple. And I think it's really impressive that just in their mid-20s, they owned a very successful restaurant, Cantina, here in Santa Ana. They were involved with all the different business people. I mean, their daughter, Sylvia Mendez, would say how her father would go flying with some of his white and also Mexican friends. So someone owned a plane and they would all take off. There was no airport here even then, so it was just a landing strip. But they were a big part of that Santa Ana community with the cantina they had. And so I think that's pretty impressive that, at their young age, they also had worked on the farm as teens as well as early on, but then decided to go into the restaurant business. So I think that kind of paints a picture. I think also people now see Orange County as residential, business centers, shopping malls, Disneyland. But back in the 1940s, this was farmland. And so much more rural. Santa Ana was the city. There were just a few major high schools. So it was really the country. And I think that perspective, when you read the book, you need to see that this was farmland. A lot of people came here to work on the farm as farm laborers.
What kind of an environment did they face when they interacted with other Americans? Did they feel like they were outsiders? Did they feel like they were treated differently when they interacted with certain groups in society?
My father would say that there were other boys that would call him names and they would get into fistfights, but then there were also other friends. So I think it wasn't a all or nothing. There were some kids that were bullies and there were some kids that were their dear friends. He went to Huntington Beach High School, and So there was no segregation of keeping he and my uncle out of the high school at that time. Now, the Mendez children, because they were Mexican, and this is where it gets really interesting, because the state let the school districts decide. And so you could be in one district with one set of rules, and just maybe even, less than 5 miles away, 3 miles away, another school district would have another set of rules. And so depending on what district you were in, determined if you went to a segregated school, or if they had a quote unquote Mexican school. And across the state, there were districts that did not let Asians into the school, that did not let Native Americans in the school, did not let Black Americans into the school. So it was based on school district, which the rules could be kind of left up to the person who was at the admissions counter, right? When you go into the school to get your children admitted, and they look at you. And that's exactly what happened in the case of Mendez. She took one look at Sylvia, Gonzalo, and Jerome, and they are darker skinned Mexicans, and their cousins, their Vidari girls, were lighter skinned Mexicans. And she was going to let the lighter skinned cousins into the 17th Street School at Westminster, but Sylvia, Jerome, and Gonzalo would have to go down the street roughly about a half a mile to the Hoover Street Mexican School, which it wasn't equal education either. It was, the classes were not your typical arithmetic, math, science, history classes. They were more learning how to speak English, how to be a good maid or gardener or laborer. And the Mendez children had already gone to a school that taught all the traditional subjects in Santa Ana, where they came from. So it just showed the complexity of that based on where you lived and what that school district's rules were.
Did you find in your research that the administrators would explain their rules ever, that they would explain why they felt that segregation was a good thing?
They did to some extent. I think the Mendez children and Estrada, Palomino, Guzman, and Ramirez families, that was the 5 families that led this class action lawsuit. In their case, all of their children spoke English. The parents spoke English. They were, business people. They had jobs. They worked in different companies. So the biggest thing was that the school districts generally said that their English is not up to par and they will not succeed. That could be true in some cases, but not in these cases. And in these cases, these families went back to the school districts, to the superintendent, to the district office, and said, we want an exception because our children do speak good English. They are capable of the work in the regular public school, and we would like to have an exception. And they were denied that. So there was there was not even English testing. I mean, it'd be one thing is if you could pass this English test, then yes, you can be permitted. It would be based on skill versus color. But there was not even an English test. So they really didn't give them any options on that. There was, and there's, if you look into the legal documents, there are some areas where the farm laborers' children came up from Mexico. They did not know English. They had very minimal housing, housing that really didn't have kitchens and restroom facilities and all of this. And so those children were at a huge disadvantage because they really didn't speak English. But that was not part of this case because these children did speak English. So if it was based on skill level, you would want to increase their skills in English and then allow them to move over. But that's where it becomes more of a color issue and a issue of prejudice than it was of skills.
Yeah. And as you said, you could have the same family walk in, and if you've got cousins who have a different shade of skin color than other cousins, They wind up going to two different schools, even though they came from the same family, the same background, the same level of English proficiency. That's a perfect test right there of what principle really mattered to them.
Right. And you have a last name Mendez versus Gonzalo Sr.'s sister had married a man whose last name was Vidari. And so it was less Mexican sounding, even though they felt that they were Mexicans. And they even said to them, if you would say you're not Mexican, we'll let you into 17th Street School, because those girls had lighter brown hair. They were fair skinned versus Sylvia with dark black hair and darker skin. So I think the case is one thing, but things that led up to the case were all these families trying to get their children into the education that they deserved and that they could do. They were very capable of it, but that was being stopped because of a general issue of racism against the Mexicans.
Yeah. When you think about applying kindness to a problem like this, as you were doing the research and you kept seeing these instances of what's very obvious, just prejudice, do you think sometimes about how kindness could have made a situation like that better? How we could spread kindness to people who are intolerant, to people who are unjust, to people who are not recognizing the human being that's right in front of them, but rather seeing a certain element of them that shouldn't matter at all. I'm wondering about, how to deal with an issue like that.
I think a story that comes to mind as you ask the question is Sylvia would talk about the fact that these are children they already knew. Because these kids came to the farm to play. So they would come they lived in the neighborhood, in the surrounding area. They would all play together. But then Monday through Friday, when they went to school, they could still take the same bus together. But then Sylvia and her brothers, when they got off the bus at 17th Street School, would have to walk roughly about a half a mile to the Mexican school. So the kids figured it out. These are their playmates, but they couldn't go to school with them. And I think that just shows you a lot about what did the kids see in each other. They saw another kid. They saw another friend. They weren't fearful. They got to know them. They knew they could speak English. They knew they could play together and have fun. So they didn't have these preconceived notions that mostly the administration / organizational administrations had kind of put in place. I think in my dad's case, he would say, yes, he was called names. He was bullied. But it wasn't an institutional kind of bullying. It was more of an individual. These kids don't like Japanese, but these kids, these are our friends. And that was a predominantly white high school at the time. It was Japanese students and white students. And probably because there were so few high schools didn't seem to be segregated generally, because there were so few of them, because again, this was a rural area, not a highly populated area. So there weren't enough to have a separate high school, but yet in elementary school, that's what they had put in place.
Interesting. Well, let's bring the farm into the story now. So how did that come about? How did your family acquire the farm? And what did it mean for your family, especially your grandfather, who had such a great love of this country that he's come to, and to be able to do something like that?
Well, it was he'd probably been in the country more than 10 years. It would be closer to 15 years. He had the opportunity to move to Orange County, to Westminster, to lease land. And he couldn't buy land because of the alien land laws didn't allow him to purchase, but he could lease land, and he started to farm. My dad was 8, 9 years old at the time. And they leased this farm from a lady, an older lady who owned the land. When she died, she gave them the first right of refusal to own the land. So there's an opportunity of kindness. She could have sold it to anyone, but she liked my grandfather, my dad, and the family, and wanted to give them an opportunity. And so this was their opportunity to purchase. The problem is my dad was only about 9 years old, and so another opportunity had to arise. They had a friend who was Hawaiian-born Japanese American who was older than my dad. He was already adult age, over 18, and he stood in as my dad's guardian, so that the farm could be put in my dad's name as a child, with a guardian of an adult Japanese man who was older. And so again, another act of kindness by her to not be giving my grandfather an opportunity to own land, my father an opportunity to own the farm. My dad at the time was just a kid, but my grandfather's English was not that good yet. And so my dad would have to go to the bank with my grandfather to translate. And so now you have this little kid going to the bank and the banker having to explain banking to the kid so he could explain it to the grandfather, or to his father, my grandfather. So that's how my dad learned about business and about banking. He didn't get to go to the USC Marshall School like I did. He learned from this banker, but I think Mr. Frank Monroe is his name. And he went over and above. I mean, my dad was so grateful to him. When I was a kid, we would visit Mrs. Monroe because her husband had already passed every single Christmas. It was always, we're going to go visit Mrs. Monroe and take her a Christmas gift, because just of the loyalty my dad felt to her husband for what he had done. And I would have loved to meet Mr. Frank Monroe because he obviously was that kind of friend also to Mr. Mendez. But that's relationship that my dad had with Mr. Monroe. And even till the day he died, that same bank location, even though Mr. Monroe was not there, my dad always had an account at that bank. And the bank's name had changed probably 10 times, right? But just the loyalty of that friendship. I think today we would call it a mentorship, of mentoring a young man who needed to know how to do accounting, how to do banking, how to do some business, because now you have this responsibility as a kid. And so obviously there's lots of different elements of kindness. I think some people might say, well, yeah, but that's the banker's job. I don't think it's a banker's job to mentor an 8-year-old kid. It goes far beyond that. And whenever I'd ask my dad, how do you know Mrs. Monroe? And he would always say, her husband was a really good friend to me. And so I think that type of friendship, or I think today we'd call it a mentorship, was a huge act of kindness in his life. Regarding the farm, my dad was about 20 years old when World War II broke out, in terms of the country of Japan bombing Pearl Harbor, and on December 7th. And then in February of the next year of 1942, my dad was 20 years old, and Executive Order 9066 comes out, presidential executive order by President Roosevelt. And it actually doesn't say in the text of 9066 Japanese Americans, but it does say essentially enemies during World War II. And so being of Japanese heritage, even though at that time, I think my grandfather had already been in the country over 25 years. My maternal grandfather had been here more like 40 years. So certainly well-established farmers in the area. But despite that, they were not new immigrants. They had lived, decades in America. they had to make decisions. And so every family had to make a decision. What were they going to do with their house, their business, whatever they owned? We owned a farm, but other people had restaurants or stores. What are they going to do? Who's going to take care of this? Many people opted to sell, and unfortunately were taken advantage of. So they really got nothing for all their hard work or the home or the business that they had built. My dad went to Mr. Monroe to say, now what do we do? You've helped us through all these things. What do we do? We have a 40-acre farm. And Mr. Monroe said, why don't we try leasing it? Which today, in today's world, sounds really, sure, lease it, But back then, I think you either owned it or you rented month to month, like if you rented an apartment or a home. This leasing idea was not as well known. And you're also leasing a whole farm with the tractor and the trucks and your house with all the furniture. I mean, this was a move-in ready farm. So the next question is, who do we rent it to? Who do we lease it to? And there is a period where it's a little unknown what happened, because the lease documents that we have don't start until more in the 1944 timeframe. So I think they had to kind of figure this out. There might have been other caretakers. There might have been other workers that my dad just said, hey, keep working and, we'll figure this out. So there was a period of confusion. But again, I think going back to what we were talking about, being present and seeing and listening to people, Mr. Monroe, the banker, he knew that Mr. Mendez, the restaurateur, the cantina owner, he knew that he had always wanted to be a farmer. Gonzalo had farmed as a farm laborer when he was a child and in his teens. And he just had this great thought that it would be great to be a farmer, own his own farm. So Mr. Monroe already knew that. And he asked Gonzalo, he goes, do you want to lease the Munemitsu farm? What do you think? This is a chance you could try it, and it's got a house, you can go live there. So Mr. Mendez rented out the home that he owned, and they moved, I don't know how many miles it is, but as the crow flies, it's not 10 miles from Santa Ana, where his family was pretty well established, to Westminster, which was the country and more of a rural area. And Sylvia, she remembers having her birthday in June on the farm. And she goes, I remember my, I think it was her 8th birthday. I remember having it on the farm, and that was very special to her. But then when school comes around in September and they go to register for the school, that's when the big problem hits. We love being on the farm. This is an adventure, where dad and mom are starting to farm. They actually also lease some additional land, another farm, and we're farming on two different properties. And all was going well until they could not be registered at the school, the regular 17th Street school. And that's what started. It's interesting because it's kind of the story of racism in terms of incarcerating innocent Japanese families because of their race, then leads to the Mendez family encountering a different kind of racism in the public schools here, that they couldn't attend, even though they were totally qualified. They had gone to a school in Santa Ana where they studied English and history and math and science, but now their only option was to go to a Mexican school that tried to teach them remedial English, that tried to teach them, as Sylvia says, it just felt like they were trying to make us, train us to be good maids. That was the feeling she had as a child. Or good gardeners, how to do service jobs, as opposed to true academic subjects.
So while they're going through that, what's the internment camp experience like? What did your family go through? What did their neighbors and community members go through? And how did they sustain themselves through that physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually? What kind of community grew up in there?
Yeah, pretty rough. I noticed a difference. My aunts are 13 years younger than my dad, and I noticed a difference in their experience. They were, 7, 8 years old. My dad was 20 years old. He was going to junior college, taking classes at Fullerton College and business and stuff. And I noticed a difference there because my aunts, while it was difficult, they felt the security of my grandmother, my dad, other families there. My dad now knows he lost the opportunity to farm. He hopes he's going to get the farm back. He lost the opportunity to go to school in college, and many there were Japanese students enrolled in along the West Coast in universities, law schools, medical schools. They were all sent out of the school, so their education just stopped. Some were able to transfer to other schools in the Midwest or East Coast, but it was still a major disruption. So I think the loss of freedom, the loss of your citizenship, really, out of the 120,000 Japanese Americans from Washington, Oregon, California that were sent to incarceration camps, 2/3 of them were born citizens. So these were not immigrants. These were the children of immigrants, essentially, the Nisei, second generation, born Americans being accused of or felt there was enough feeling that even the women and children could be spies for Japan, even though there was no evidence of that. And so, as my parents would describe it, and a great resource to actually see what it might have been like, Manzanar is up on 395 on your way to Mammoth. It's probably one of the best maintained internment camps, and it's run by the National Park Service. So they have exhibits, barracks, and things. The Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, downtown Los Angeles, has a great exhibit, so you could actually see what the barracks were like. But they were essentially plyboard with tar paper. Post in Arizona, where our family was, and it was mostly all the people from Orange County were in Post in Arizona. It's right on the other side of the Colorado River on the California border, California-Arizona border. That land was actually the Colorado River Indian Tribe Reservation. And the government said, we are going to put 18,000 Japanese here. And the tribal leaders said, we don't agree with this. Native Americans, probably better than anyone, understands what it is like to be relocated and taken away from your land and home. And the tribal leaders said, no, you're not. We don't want to be any part of this. But the government intervened, and basically they put 18,000 Japanese in the middle of the desert, very makeshift barracks. And if you don't live in the California desert, you don't realize this, but it's bitterly cold and it's horrendously hot, right? I mean, it's 120 on a good day in the summer, and it's cold, 20 or 30. So these were not well insulated. These were barracks. They were 20 by 25 feet spaces in one long building. So I think 4 families lived in one barrack, one room for each family. And they basically, other than that space and some makeshift like platform beds, they had to provide what they needed for the length of time that they were going to be there. And they didn't really know. I mean, now we know it was roughly about 3 years for most of the families in most of the 10 internment camps. But at that time, you're going into this unknown. It's like, are we going to be here forever? Is the war going to end? What's going to happen? Are we all going to be more like prisoners of war? What's going to happen? And in fact, a lot of the men, including my grandfather, were taken by the FBI because of their somewhat leadership role in community organizations. So my grandfather was a leader of the local Japanese school, Japanese language school. And they had set that up because they wanted to continue to have their children not only know English, but also know Japanese. Because of his role on that. And he also had a role in a group, the Kochiken Club. Well, Kochi is the prefecture in Japan he's from. And this was all of the people. It would be like if you and I moved from California and we went to Japan and started the California Club. We could talk about, the beach and Yosemite and Disneyland, and also, let's make sure, let's get some tacos and do things that we're used to in our homeland. That's what this club was for. It's kind of a family organization. Let's get the families together. So because of his involvement in both of those, he was taken by the FBI from the farm a couple of days before the whole family had to evacuate. And pretty traumatic. I mean, as I looked at this history, my grandmother, man, she was a lady and she was a warrior because her husband was leaving. She had 19 and 20-year-old sons and two little 7 and 8-year-old twin daughters. And her husband wasn't here. And now we're leaving our home. And where are we going? Really, really difficult. My dad kind of became the head of the family. My grandfather was gone for about 2.5 years in a Department of Justice camp that was in the Santa Fe, New Mexico area. And so they could write, but they really did not, but he was isolated from them. And I asked my aunts, like, where did you think Grandpa was? Like, were you worried about him? And being young girls, my grandmother just said, well, because the government thinks your father is important, he is living in another camp. And so, you're only 7 and 8. It's like, okay, well, mom's here and, we've got other friends here. So, okay. So you don't really question things like that, right? But nonetheless, for my grandmother and my dad, and they knew he was being interrogated, questioned of his loyalty, and being literally asked to give up his Japanese passport, but he wasn't being allowed to be a citizen of the US. So it wasn't like, become a citizen of the US, give up your Japanese passport. It was give up your Japanese passport and you're in limbo, which would not be a good place to be. At least with a Japanese passport, he could go back to Japan if America decided he couldn't stay. But without that, he had no options. So they put these men in pretty desperate places with desperate decisions, I think, especially being the first generation. Their English was not as good. I mean, my grandfather had my dad as translator through all those years, and now he wasn't there. But life in the posting camp, and I think most everyone I've heard talk about the camp experience, it was hot, it was cold, it was dry, it was dusty, it was communal living. Japanese have a culture of cleanliness. This was far from anything like that. They made do with what they had. But they, if you didn't have a winter coat, then you better get a winter coat. That wasn't going to be provided. So my father did sell, I think he sold some cars, some really beloved things that he had, so that they could have some money there, because anything that was beyond, basic food, which wasn't what Japanese were used to eat, especially Japanese farmers, because you're growing all your fresh produce and getting fresh fish and things like that. My one aunt just talks about how terrible the food was, and how to this day, there are certain things she will not eat, even if it's delicious, because it was served in camp. And I think that was an experience many people had. But the Japanese are very resourceful. I mean, I have a piece of paper that was the camp director had sent out to everyone. And he basically says in that one-page thing, now that you're here, this is your opportunity to make this a model community. And when I read that, that is just the worst thing I think you could do. It's like, we took away your home, moved you out here, and now you're going to make this a model community, right? I mean, that's to some degrees, what an insult. And but in fact, I think I have a chapter in the book called Silent Voices, Silent Protest. And while not everyone was silent, there were protests, there were legal cases against the validity of this. I think for my parents and my grandmother, they were being accused of not being good citizens, essentially. And so a Japanese way of persevering through that is, we're going to be the best citizens you've ever seen. We're going to show you. And I think that mentality, at least for our family and other friends' families, is we're going to persevere. And there's a Japanese word, gaman, gambate. It kind of means like, let's do this. So you might hear it at sports events and stuff like that. But when that word is said in our family, this really means you got to dig down deep and you're going to persevere against all odds, kind of perseverance and fortitude. And I think that's really the spirit in which they tried to make the best of a really bad situation. I think, especially for my grandmother, she really tried to kind of neutralize the situation, because she had 2 young daughters and she wanted them to not be scared. So she probably held all of that inside. All of her fear was held inside so that she could be there for the 2 girls. And my dad and my mother was also in the same camp, although they didn't know each other at that time. But they would just say, it was hot, it was dry, it was dusty. We did what we could. We made a lot of other Japanese friends, because now all the Japanese on the West Coast are in one of these 10 camps. So we tried to do the best we could, and persevere. I think things that gave them hope, I think to some degree it was some of the kindness from their friends and family that were back here in Orange County. Gave them hope. I think being in a community with each other gave them hope. And certainly at least for my mother's family, their faith gave them hope. I mean, the Japanese, they set up churches in these camps. So there was typically, it seems like, a Catholic, a Christian, and a Buddhist church for church services. They set up, my aunts were in brownies. There were people who were Girls and Boy Scout troop leaders who are now in camp. So they're like, well, let's just set this up for the kids. They set up sports teams for the young kids, baseball, basketball, all of those kinds of sports. So they tried to neutralize the impact by creating that environment there. They built Adobe auditoriums for the schools. They built the school. They worked on water systems to bring water into the middle of the reservation. That had not existed before. They built roads. They brought in electricity. So now you have a workforce of, there were 18,000 people in Poston. So let's say probably 40% or a third of them were men. So now you have roughly a pretty good workforce to get out there and just work. And I think in some case, at least for my family, I can't speak for everyone, but I think that kind of hard work helped them in a difficult situation during the war, and then after the war. It helped there was no therapy, there was no trauma therapy for them, but being able to be productive, I think, helped them mentally to say, we're making some progress. And waiting for decisions to be made of what their future would be.
And at the same time now, we've got 2 sets of injustices that have been described here and 2 sets of lawsuits that are emanating out of them. So let's transition back over to the farm for a minute. What does that lawsuit look like for the Mendez family? What are the arguments that they're making in the court case, and what is the rationale that the judges are giving in their rulings?
So Mr. Mendez finds attorney Marcus, David Marcus. David Marcus was Jewish. He actually worked for the Mexican consulate. So even though he was Jewish, he was kind of known as the Mexican attorney. And he had won some cases in different parts of LA on behalf of Mexican Americans. And Mr. Mendez, through a friend, hears about Mr. Marcus, contacts him and says, would you come and talk to us? We want to do something about the schools. The two of them go around Orange County and find other families to join them in this case. So that's where the Estrada, Palomino, Guzman, and Ramirez family become part of this. And it becomes a class action lawsuit. Mr. Marcus does a lot of research. I think he's really key in this. And he figures out that if I make this a case about race, we're going to lose. They're just going to change the laws. They're going to now change the wording. And he decides it should be a federal case, and it should be about citizens' rights, that these children are citizens of the United States and their rights are not being equally treated. And I think that makes a big difference. I'm no legal expert by any means, but I think his strategy and how he thought about this, and perhaps even being Jewish, he himself had been a victim of prejudice as a young boy, and also being working for the Mexican consulate. I'm sure he had seen other types of things with racism and prejudice, and so I think he's very, very key in this, and just how he thought about the case makes a huge difference. I also think it's notable that when they go to the federal court, Judge McCormick has a lot of integrity. He's seen, from what I've read, he's seen as somebody who's very involved in the community. Very much, he took a long time to decide on this case, which just tells us how much he really studied it and how important he knew this was going to be. And so I think those two are definitely key players in it. There were other cases brought up in the court system. I'm not an expert on all of them by any means. There were other court cases brought up about the segregated schools. What makes Mendez different? I would lean to say it was David Marcus and Judge McCormick. It also could have been maybe the timing. One thing that I didn't know, and I haven't researched much, but I did see this in the story, is you had a lot of Americans of all races go to the war, go to World War II and fight. World War I and World War II, but in World War II, you had Mexican soldiers, you had Black soldiers, you had Japanese soldiers go into the war to fight for this country. And when they came back, they find out they don't have equal rights. Their children might not have equal rights. And I think that timing could also play into the reason that Mendez versus Westminster and other things that were happening in this same time. Jackie Robinson went into the major leagues, same month, same year as this case got decided. So there were other movements of racial equality. The themes were prominent. And I do think it did play because a lot of service people, a lot of our veterans, or families who even lost family members that were Mexican or Black or Asian, Japanese, Chinese, were now saying, wait, we fought for this country. We're citizens. Why are we segregated? Why are we not getting the same rights and privileges in schooling and owning businesses, in buying homes and things? I think that probably played into it as well. just based on the timing and some things that I have read.
Coming back to the theme of the book, the kindness that we're looking to foster among people, some of it sounds like kindness often emerges out of recognizing the commonality among all human beings, that when they're fighting together in World War II, they see themselves as being on the same side. They see themselves as making a shared sacrifice. And unfortunately, it took that really tragic event for them to recognize it. But all they were doing at the end of the day was realizing that they have more in common than what divides them, that there is this shared humanity, and that maybe opens the doors to their inner kindness. Does that strike you as some of what you witnessed in this research?
I think so. I mean, when you're together in the military, you are, working together for a common goal. You're looking out for each other, and you get to know each other really well, right? And I think that getting to know each other really well comes back to what we were talking about earlier: is being present, knowing this person, seeing them, understanding where they're from, what their lives are like. So you begin to see, like, this person is just like me, right? Although we have different histories, different cultures, maybe different traditions, we're people. So I do think that probably leads to a lot more empathy, and also leads to more collaboration and understanding. I think there's an interesting story. Daniel Brown wrote a best-selling novel. It's about this thick, but it's excellent. It's called Facing the Mountain, and it's about the Japanese American 442nd unit, highly, highly decorated unit in World War II, and they fought in the European venues, Italy, and in those areas, France. But one thing that he said that was very, very interesting, because this 442nd, they were all Japanese Americans, but some were from Hawaii and some were from the mainland. And at one point, they couldn't figure out why these two groups of Japanese Americans were still not really unified. They were still divided. They couldn't figure out what the difference was. And one of their superior officers started to realize that the Hawaiian soldiers were talking about how when they go home to Hawaii, they're going to be heroes, and they have families and girlfriends, and there's going to be a parade, and everyone's going to welcome them back. The Japanese Americans from the mainland, who were mostly all Washington, Oregon, and California, and their families were now in incarceration camps, they didn't know where they were going to go back to. They didn't have the big, we're going to be welcome back. We're people without a home. We're living in the middle of desolate deserts. And that friction between the two caused that unit to not be as unified as most other units. And so the superior officers said, we're going to fix this. And they sent the Hawaiian soldiers to one of the internment camps in Arkansas. And that's where they realized, whoa, this is where all the mainland Japanese Americans, this is where their families are. Now we can empathize with the difference. They have no homes to go back to. They don't know what their futures will be. Where in Hawaii, Asians are a majority. And so they knew they would have a future when they would go home. Not so much for the mainland soldiers. And I think it's kind of a really striking picture of where is home, right? There wasn't going to be a parade when they came home. Downtown Honolulu, yes. Downtown LA, probably not. Or Seattle, or Portland, or San Francisco. And I thought in Daniel Brown's book that was really striking. That's something I hadn't really understood as well as he laid that out. And so I think it really depended. Our history from that, what I take is our history of what home is um, can be really different. And so now you had men who were fighting not to go home because they didn't really have a home, at least in the short term. They didn't know what their future would be.
And it strikes me as particularly ironic because one of the things you talk about in the book is how the courts justified the internment camps by citing military necessity. But what you're pointing out is it was precisely the opposite, that these soldiers are struggling to fight and to be a coherent unit because of the injustices that are happening to their families back home. It's actually eroding morale rather than boosting it. And it's one of the things that I think fear and hate and prejudice do to people is that they blind them to seeing the bigger picture. They're so focused on whatever it is they're afraid of that they don't recognize that a kinder approach would actually serve their own purposes better in the long run.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think in that book, the commanding officer said, these are great soldiers, but they need to be unified. What is causing this division? And then he realized one had a concept of home and the others, their home was now in an internment camp. So to get their understanding, he had to unify them in terms of what are we really fighting for? They were trying, I mean, their whole goal was to say, we are American citizens too, and we will give our lives up to show you that we are. Different kind of way. My father had polio, was not able to serve because of his leg in the war. But I think the people in the internment camp said, we are going to make this the best camp we can make. We are going to build clubs. We're going to have youth groups. We're going to, build Japanese gardens in the middle of the desert. We're going to show people in the desert how to farm this. And it's still very prosperous farmland, the Indian reservation area. We're going to do all these things, and we are going to overcome this adversity. And that's how we're going to fight. It's like a silent fight. I call it silent protest, I think, in the book. But it's that Japanese Ganbatte spirit. It's like, we're going to overcome this. And they will go to know, that spirit of, we are going to do this and show you, whether it be surviving in the desert or being out on the front of the war when our parents, our sisters, our brothers, our aunts and uncles are all in an internment camp in our own country. So, just it doesn't seem to make sense, except for they were trying to show what good Americans they are.
Yeah. The last question I'll ask, because I know that we've been going for a while and I don't want to keep the audience too much longer, but from that experience that you've described and from all the narrative that you've weaved together in your research, do you draw inspiration from that as you move forward? Do you draw inspiration from the examples that your forebears set for you, and an inspiration that we all can draw from it as we try to make a better, kinder world?
I think the spirit of community is huge, whether that be the community here in Orange County that my dad and grandparents and mother had before. They had friends here. Those friends, they knew their whole lives. They were friends before camp, during camp, and after camp. Those relationships are really, really important, that type of community. I think the other community that they built was a very strong Japanese American community, because in these camps, depending on where you lived, determined to some degree which of the incarceration camps you went to. And so Orange County, California, there were about 1,800 Japanese Americans at that time. For the most part, everyone went to Poston, Arizona. And for my parents and a lot of their friends, they were around college age, high school, college age. And so this became kind of their young adult experience, a tough one. Some went on to be able to go out to college. My one uncle went to Iowa during this time and was able to go to college and become a surgeon. So some of them were able to petition and continue their education, but it would be on the East Coast, in the Midwest or East Coast, far from the Pacific. Others worked in the camps. My aunt and mom, they both had jobs within the camp, in the employment office, in the legal office. Because you've got, in Poston, Arizona, there were probably about 18,000 Japanese in the middle of the desert. And so you have to have your own community. You know, there were stores, there were post offices, there were legal services, there were employment just within the camp. And I think just knowing how bad that can be, being relocated in the middle of a desert, it's bitterly cold and horribly hot. It takes a lot of community to do that together. They made lifelong friends there. I mean, that is a positive outcome. I mean, they would have made lifelong friends other places too, but I mean, what they endured together, I think, marks those friendships. They would do anything for those friends that they made. I think the other thing is just how quick we are to judge and accuse people of something because of their race or color. There was never found any act of spy activity amongst the Japanese Americans. I mean, again, my grandfather had been here 25 years and the other one almost 40 years in America. These were farmers. And they wrote letters to their family and friends in Japan, but they also had to take a ship to get there, right? There were no airplanes. So the evidence, I think, being too quick to judge because of someone's race is really, really dangerous. Because I think that's largely what happened. Because you're Japanese American, we're going to accuse you before we figure out if there's any fact base, but there was never found any fact base to incarcerate the Japanese Americans. There was no spy activity. And we're talking, a lot of people. And there was no spy activity with Japan or anything like that. So I think, having hearts to really get to know people for who they are and not making blanket statements based on race or where you're from or income is another thing I think that builds community. We have much more in common than we're different, right? In most cases, in almost all cases, I think.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. Mm-hmm. And that's a perfect message to end on. Thank you. I really appreciate you taking the time and sharing the story and all the time that you put into researching the story and unearthing, parts of both families' histories that could have easily been lost to history if you hadn't done that. Mm-hmm. I hope that everyone in our audience really appreciates all the work that went into it and all the lessons we can take from it.
Thanks. It's been a journey, but I also just kind of want to reiterate, like Mr. Mendez and the other families really stood up for equal opportunity for their children to have a great education here. And the two stories parallel, but I think it does talk about the strength of community. And really, you have to persevere through a lot, but in community, I think you have great opportunities to make change, positive change in the right way.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you both so much. It was a lovely conversation. I really appreciate the time that you took with us today. And to our guests, I encourage you to look up the book, The Kindness of Color. I said the title backwards in the beginning, The Kindness of Color. And we'll put a link on our website. Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Janice. Thanks, Anne, for putting this together. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much to everyone, Anne and Aubrey. Thank you, Anthony, too. It's great to be able to talk with you.
My pleasure. Thank you, everybody.